Muhammad was illiterate. So he's not said to have been a learned individual. He's not able to discern between the difference between an actual historical source like, say, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and apocryphal Christian tales that are floating around the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad dies, and actually the Muslims who are following him have a hesitancy to write it down because Muhammad never told them to write it down.
Muslims are taught to believe that the Bible is unreliable because there are different versions of it.
When I see 10 different versions, I question it. Coming from God? How do we have 10 versions? Did God write this, or did the believers of God write it? But when I only see one version, and I can show you the chains of authenticity, then I believe in it.
Well, there's several big historic problems with this view, and in this video, Wes Huff exposes a few of them. Then at the end, I'll add one of my own that actually might be the most significant place where Islam and history depart from each other.
The Quran. After you read the book the first time, what was your impression? Did you say, oh, wow, complete different understanding than what I thought was going to be in the book of Quran? This is actually a great book. I actually enjoyed this. I actually learned this. What was your impression at the end?
I mean, have you ever read the Quran?
I've never read the book.
Okay, so the Quran is interesting in that when you come to it, especially if you're a Christian and you're expecting things to be chronological, and when you open up a Bible, Genesis...
Structured.
Right. Genesis says, in the beginning, and that's in the beginning, and by the time you get to the end, Revelation is the end, right? The Quran is structured differently in that the biggest chapters are at the beginning and the smallest chapters are at the end. So there's 114 surahs or chapters in the Quran, and the way that it's been put together and structured is very, very different than something like the Bible, in that it's not in a narrative theme or a chronological theme, but it's on the basis of the chapters. And there are various reasons for that in terms of the overall way that the Quran eventually got codified. Because during Muhammad's lifetime, the Quran was oral. And actually, there was a hesitancy after Muhammad died in 632, I believe it was. Muhammad dies. I could be wrong on that date. I'm just going off the top of my head.
632 AD on June 8th, apparently, for those who are interested.
Muhammad dies, and actually the Muslims who are following him have a hesitancy to write it down because Muhammad never told them to write it down. But there's this process that eventually gets put into place because Muhammad's successors in the caliphs realize that people have memorized the Quran differently. And so
What does that mean? Memorize the Quran differently?
Yeah. So you had these individuals who were following Muhammad around and they were memorizing everything he was saying. And so part of this process is that we're remembering things slightly differently. And I believe it was so Abu Bakr, I think, is the second rightly guided caliph in the succession after Muhammad. He's the person who starts the process of kind of bringing together all of these recitations of the Quran. And then that's finalized under a later caliph by the name of Uthman. And Uthman, I think when they come to Abu Bakr, the statement literally that they say is, save us before we differ like the Christians and the Jews before us. And that they saw that there were some things that the Christians and the Jews were disagreeing on between their written texts, and they didn't want that to happen with the Quran. And so there's a period of time under Uthman where it's called the Uthmanic revision, where he gathers all of these documents together, all of these different recitations, and he codifies it into one document and he destroys all of the differing ones. So in that sense, you do have a standardized version, but it's in terms of like the history of how texts are produced and disseminated, it's what's called a controlled transmission. It's essentially a government oversight of it, right? So the great thing about having only one version is that you don't have any disagreements, but if you only have one version, you have to trust that the guy who compiled that one version got it right. And there were actually companions of Muhammad within the oral or within the traditional sources of Islamic literature called the Hadith that talk about the fact that there were particular individuals who were very close to Muhammad during his lifetime who did not want to give their Quran kind of versions to Uthman because they knew that theirs was going to differ with Uthman's and he would probably destroy it.
Take the next 60 seconds to learn about Mando. It was created by a doctor who saw how normal body odor was being misdiagnosed and mistreated. So instead of just masking odor, Mando stops it before it starts using something called mandelic acid. I know that sounds like an ad from the 1950s. Mando uses mandelic acid to turn smelly men into real men. But it's actually clinically proven. Think of this as a pre-odorant rather than a deodorant. Mando is a high-performance whole-body deodorant that you can apply everywhere, such as pits, packages, and feet. They've also got amazing scents like bourbon leather, clover woods, Mount Fiji, and Pro Sport. For those who like it simple, there's also an unscented option. Plus, there's no baking soda, no parabens, no stains, and it's totally skin-free. Mando is clinically proven to control odor better than a shower with soap alone. Mando's starter bundle is great for new customers. It comes with a full-size stick deodorant, a cream deodorant tube, or a spray deodorant, and 2 free products like the wipes or mini body wash. Also, there's free US shipping, and just for my followers, Mando is offering an extra $5 off when you order. So click the link in the description below, enter code DDOW at checkout, and get a deal of 40% off of your Mando products. Now back to the video.
You have these are not, controversial in the sense that these are part of the traditional Islamic sources in the Hadith. But I think within the history of how the Quran gets put together, you see something very different than what you see in the Bible. And so when you're reading it, especially if what I did, open up the front and then read all the way through, there are parts of the Quran that are confusing because they don't necessarily follow what would be considered a overly rational order in terms of the flow of the text. So I open it up, I read it. Some things sound familiar in some ways, and that it's talking about Moses and Noah and even, Jesus, Mary are in there. But there are components of it that they're so far from what the biblical narrative is that it just seems off. And I think there's a very
off in a sense that it's not
chronological.
Where it's not in. Is that what you mean? That's off, or
well, the stories are very different a lot of the time. So,
okay.
What I think we can derive from the historical record is basically that if you take the traditional Islamic narrative, Muhammad was illiterate, so he's not said to have been a learned individual. And so he is, if we take the traditional narrative once again, he's a caravaner in 7th century Arabia. And so he is going around Arabia in the Arabian Peninsula. He's going up into countries like what are today modern day Jordan.
What is this, Rob? Is this ChatGPT you pulled up, or
no? This was just Google.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah. So if we go by that traditional narrative, he's a caravaner. He's going around. He's being exposed to Christians and Jews because they're all over the place in Syria and in Jordan and in Iraq. These were Christian countries a lot of the time. And he's hearing these stories about who the Christians and the Jews believe are their prophets and individuals within that are part of the religion. But he's not able to discern between the difference between an actual historical source like, say, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and, say, apocryphal Christian tales that are floating around the Arabian Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And so because there is this inability to actually discern between those sources, some of those things get incorporated into the Quran. So, and we can trace this. A friend of mine, Andy Bannister, did his PhD dissertation, and then he published a book on this. It's called The Oral Formulaic Construction of the Quran, where we can actually tie certain stories in the Quran to apocryphal sources that were floating around in the subsequent centuries after Jesus. So there's a document called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, which is very different. But the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas has a story where Jesus, the childhood Jesus, is making clay birds beside a riverbank. And the Jewish officials get mad at him because he's doing this on the Sabbath. He's breaking the Sabbath. They go off to get his parents to get him into trouble. And Jesus breathes on the birds. They turn into real birds and they fly away. So this is an apocryphal story. It comes centuries after the actual historical Jesus. It has no historical ties to the historical Jesus, but it's a popular story that's being incorporated into this infancy narrative.
In the Quran.
So the Quran adopts it. So we can trace it to the infancy gospel of Thomas and then the later Arab infancy gospel of Thomas, the Quran borrows it and incorporates it, but we know that it's not an actual historical story of Jesus. So when I say that there were stories that like they're
So
familiar,
what's your point with that? What's your point with that?
that there are stories that are familiar in that you're seeing the name Jesus, you're seeing the name John the Baptist, you're seeing the name Mary. But when you're reading these stories about them in the Quran, they're not stories that they're not echoing biblical stories as much as they're talking about these characters in very different ways that if you don't know about, say, where these sources are coming from, if you're not looking into the infancy narratives, then you're like, well, what is this? Like, this is confusing. Is this more information? Is this right information? And so now later in life, in my formal education, digging into some of those things and figuring out, okay, well, here's how we trace those sources. Here's the paper trail. Here's how we can connect those dots between where potentially the author of the Quran was actually getting them from. That's when I did a lot of that legwork. But originally, I was reading the Quran, and I found it unusual, but I also found it did not accurately reflect things that I was looking for to answer the ultimate questions of like meaning and purpose and morality.
So I actually think that this point that he's making right here is super important, because if it's true that Muhammad is using traditions and things that are not actually of a historic nature and integrating those into the Quran, that's a really big problem for the Quran. And I can actually think of one example of this that is absolutely testable, where the Quran disagrees with the claims of Christianity, the claims of the Bible, and the agreement of secular historians. And that would be the crucifixion of Jesus. So the Bible obviously clearly states that Jesus was crucified, that he died, that he rose from the dead. The Quran says Jesus was not crucified, but was actually made to appear so. So the reason that this is so important is that there are more sources for the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross, for the death of Jesus, than any other event in the ancient world. Furthermore, these sources are not just internal sources or biblical sources. You do have the four Gospels describing this. You have Paul's letters describing this. You have the Acts of the Apostles describing this. But you also have Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing about this. Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, writing about this. Lucian, writing about this. Mara bar Serpian, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, writing about this in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. The Jewish Talmud, interestingly, writes about this. And then you have the church fathers, Ignatius, Justin Martyr. The overwhelming majority of historians, including secular Jewish and Christian scholars, agree that Jesus was crucified. New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan, who is, by the way, a skeptic, says, quote, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Again, that's a skeptic saying that. Similarly, atheist Bart Ehrman, who I'm sure you're familiar with, says the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life. And finally, Craig Evans, N.T. Wright, Gary Habermas, and virtually all credentialed scholars in relevant fields affirm Jesus's crucifixion as a historic event. And again, the details of the crucifixion that indicate that this crucifixion actually led to a death are crystal clear. People didn't get crucified in the 1st century in Rome and not die. There's zero evidence of that. And there's a bunch of, again, even medical, we could do a whole other video on the medical signs that show that he really was dead. So this is just one point that I want to hammer home, where you actually have historians, like 99% of historians, acknowledging that Jesus died on the cross in the 1st century under Pontius Pilate. And again, that's internal and external. And then you have 600 years later, Muhammad kind of trying to piece together amalgamation of different events and stories and narratives in the formation of the Quran in the way that Wes Huff is describing here. And he gets this extremely, extremely critical detail wrong. And again, the Quran as a source is 600 years after the fact. So I think that, again, there's a lot of other examples of this that we could use, but this is probably just the most dramatic, where you have the Quran on the opposite side of an issue as both essentially all historians and Christianity and the Bible testifying to the death of Jesus on the cross. I think that the Quran clearly has to be seen as being outweighed by earlier and greater sources that, again, scholars in relevant fields are looking at this and saying, no, Jesus definitely died on the cross under Pontius Pilate in the 1st century under Tiberius Caesar. Like, this is a historic fact. It's very odd that the Quran disagrees with that historic fact. And I think it does undermine, or at least raise the question about what else is kind of being erroneous within this sort of amalgamation that Muhammad was putting together 600 years after the fact. So just an interesting kind of thread from history to look at. I like the way that Wes kind of broke this down. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. I wanted to let you guys know really quick that we have a lot of free offerings that we're giving away now. You can find out more about them at dailydoseofwisdom.com. There's a free newsletter, there's a free documentary, there's free access to a portion of the Wisdom Society. There's also a podcast that we have on Spotify and Apple. Check all of it out in the link below. Thanks for watching.